Good evening. My name is George Kain III, and we are here today at the Emig Mansion on North George Street in Emigsville, Pennsylvania. The date is Tuesday, October 28, 2008, and I have the privilege tonight of interviewing Mr. Ray Eugene Emig, who is a longtime resident of Emigsville, and I'm going to ask him some questions about what he remembers of our little village and ask him to share any stories and so forth that he feels would be of interest to future generations. So, Mr. Emig, it's a pleasure to see you here tonight. We thank you for coming. Feel free to call me George. And
I sure will, George.
Okay. And is it okay if I call you Ray?
Yes.
All righty. Well, let's start out. What year were you born, and when?
I was born August 11th, 1932, in Violet Hill, actually at the Church of the Brethren, just south of York.
Okay. And when did you come to Emigsville?
I came to Emigsville when I think I was in the 5th grade.
Okay, so you would have been about 10 or 11?
About 9 or 10, yeah.
Okay. All righty.
Yeah, when I come, it was amazing to me, but Charlie Drawball was our teacher, and there was 2 other teachers, I can't remember their name, but they sort of quizzed me on a few things, and they didn't happen to have a 6th grade, so they put me right on through to the 7th grade. Wow, I thought that was big time stuff.
I can understand that. That must have been quite a thrill for a youngster in those days to be advanced in grade like that.
It sure was, but later on I just maybe wished they wouldn't have.
Well, now, how was it that you came to Emigsville if you were originally born south of York at Violet Hill?
Well, my father was always a farmer, and there's a fellow by the name of J. Whitmer Emig contacted him that he really needed a farmer on this farm over here, the Emig farm, and we ended up signing a contract, and we farmed it until it went into the industrial park.
Okay. Now, for the benefit of people who may not be familiar with your family history or familiar with Emigsville itself, who were your parents?
My parents were John and Maisie Emig.
Okay. And did you have brothers and sisters?
Yes. I had 4 brothers and 2 sisters.
And were you somewhat in the middle age-wise, or?
Yes, I was. I had 3 brothers older and 2 sisters older. Then it was me, and then my youngest brother, Gail.
Okay. And did the whole family come here to Emigsville at that time?
The whole complete family came at that time,
Okay.
except the 2 older ones were married.
All right. Now, for people who may not be familiar with where the Emig farm is located, could you describe in modern day terms where a person would find the farm that you're going to be talking about?
Well, if you come to the center of Emigsville, and I don't know what's on the corner now, but if you turn,
There's a gasoline station.
yes, turn right at the gasoline station, and go over right under the railroad tracks, and immediately there's where the farm started. It's now the York Industrial Park.
Okay. Approximately how big was the farm?
The farm was 145 acres.
And your father and your family then were essentially tenant farmers? Or?
Yes, we were. We never owned the farm.
Okay.
We were related distantly, but we never really owned the farm.
Okay. Do you know the relationship between your family and the Emig family that owned the farm?
Yes, I do, and I'm digging farther, but as far as we can tell now, there was 2 brothers came from Germany. One was Valentine Emig, who settled right around here. The other one was John Philip Emig, and he settled in Cadorus Township. Now, John Philip was my great-grandfather. He had a son named Charles, who was my grandfather, and then my dad, John.
Okay. Now, approximately when did your family leave Emigsville?
You know, I can't really answer that because I got married and left the farm, and it was whenever the industrial park, when it was sold for the industrial park, is when it was. I can't really tell you the exact.
Based on my own knowledge of having lived in Emigsville since 1957, I know that the farm still existed in the late 1950s. And
Oh,
I'm
yes.
guessing that in the 1960s approximately.
Yes, it was in the 60s probably, maybe the early 70s, but the late 60s.
Now, when
along
did
there.
you get married?
I got married when I was 21 years old. I'm 76 now.
And who is your wife?
And the wife, that was my first wife, and I got my second wife on December 24th, 1976.
Okay. Now, when you had your first marriage, that's when you left the farm and went out on your own?
Yes, I rented a farm from Dr. Dubler, who had a farm up at Camp Hill, and then I started farming on my own there.
Okay. Where do you live now?
I live down in Selbyville, Delaware.
Well, we certainly appreciate very much your coming this long distance, actually twice. You spoke several weeks ago at Otterbein United Methodist Church, and you've been gracious enough to come back this evening, which we appreciate.
Yes, I really enjoy doing it.
Now, what are some of the fun things you did as a youngster? Because if you were living here from the age of approximately 10 to 21, that's about an 11-year period when
Yeah.
you were a youngster growing up.
Oh, yeah. Well, what we used to do, we'd pretty much so in the evenings, excuse me, we'd come over, we'd start our evening at Strick's gas station. There was a fellow named Mr. Strickler. He owned the gas station where it is now. And then there was a crowd, he fixed cars right on the other side of it, sort of below it. And Mundus's store was on the other corner. And that we'd all meet around Mundus's store or Strick's, and we'd sort of go from there.
So we're talking like the 1940s, late 1930s?
Yeah, yep, in the 40s.
Okay. Now, who were some of your friends and classmates and people that you knew that lived in Emigsville at that time?
Well, there was an awful lot of them, and it so much went over this old brain of mine, and I know the Krauts. I knew all of them very well and run around with them. There's a fella named Lynn Hudson who'll really be at the meeting tonight, just so we can see each other.
Sure.
And my gosh, there's just a bunch of them. Smoke Snellbaker, I always credit myself for teaching him. He was a pretty good race car driver, as you know.
Tell us a little bit about him, because I know he was at the meeting at the church
Yeah.
a few weeks ago and spoke up.
Well, he didn't have a father, and his family lived in the row houses right there by the American Acme Company. And he'd spend more time with us probably than he did at home. Mom would always feed him probably 1-2 meals a day, and he'd be out in the field with us or whatever. And he was just, I'll tell you how small he was. The bolt or the screw on that holds the steering wheel on, he'd have to stand up. When it hit a bump, his nose would hit that. And it was a 1932 John Deere B tractor. I'd stand on back in the drawbar and run the clutch for him, and he'd steer it.
Now, what was farm life like for you at that time?
Well, I'll tell you, I really enjoyed it. When we farmed, we milked 45 cows by hand. We had always farmed 10 acres of tobacco, 10 acres of tomatoes, or 12 sometimes, and 10 acres of sage tea. So it was all pretty labor intensive, but I enjoyed every bit of it. What I really enjoyed is the latter end of the tobacco crop, you'd have to hang it in the shed, let it dry, and then after Thanksgiving, on a nice rainy, misty night, you'd get as much as you could down into the back of the cellar and keep it damp. And then you'd have to strip it, and scythe it, and bale it. And I can still remember the snow would be blowing, and we'd be up there stripping and sizing tobacco, and a stove in there, and we had neon lights, and we always had hot water and coffee, and Bing Crosby playing on the radio, and it was just a great time. I always hated to go down to do the barn work in the evening.
Mm-hmm. So what was a typical day like? What time would you get up? What were your chores?
Well, we'd get up at 5 in the morning, and then we'd milk the cows and feed them, and clean the stables out and rebed them, and then we'd go for breakfast. And when you talk about eating breakfast, after you've done all that, could you ever eat breakfast? And then about 9 o'clock, you get back out. You'd maybe turn the cattle out for a little exercise and freshen up everything. And then if it was winter, you'd tie them back in. If it was summer, they'd go out to pasture. And then you'd start doing the field work. And you'd do that till about 4 o'clock. Then you'd have to bring the cattle back in, milk them, feed everything like that. And about 7:30, you'd eat dinner in the evening.
What kind of things would you do after dinner, or were you so tired you'd go right to bed?
Well, you were so tired about in the morning, especially when you were running around and stayed out a little late, you thought you couldn't make it through the day. But you know, about 4 or 5 o'clock would come in the afternoon, you'd start feeling a little better, and by about 7:30, you were wondering what you were going to get into that night.
And I guess that it varied a little bit depending on the season and whether you were in school or not?
Yeah, but those cows had to be milked and fed before we even went to school.
I guess a lot of people today don't realize that in all probability you couldn't take a vacation. You can't just leave a farm like that and go away for a weekend. So.
No, you can't. It's a 24/7 thing, and you'd have to take turns at it. And if somebody wanted off a day or two, well, we'd just cover for them, you know.
Sure.
But it was a wonderful way of life. You never went hungry, and it was just, I loved it.
Mm-hmm. Now, you've been back to Emigsville now twice in the last month, and I assume some visits in recent years. What are some of the big changes that you noticed from your younger days till now in the town?
Well, the growth. Everything seems to really have taken off. But you know something, that the old underpass of the railroad, they never did a thing to it. You still have to wait till another car comes through. And looking back at what I'd done when I was younger, some of the things I can remember, the first television I ever saw was Chauncey Schaefer had an appliance store. And there was a big world championship fight coming on. You know, I think it was Jersey Joe Walcott, but I wasn't sure. He put a television out on his porch, and I mean, he had about 3/4 of Emigsville around there just watching that fight.
Now, you would have been living here when World War II broke out, Pearl Harbor?
Yeah.
How do you remember?
I really wasn't here when it broke out.
Oh.
But at the end.
Okay. All right. What was school like?
School? Well, it was pretty good, but it isn't like it is today. If that had anything to do in the farm, you'd just write a note and you'd give it to the principal, and he'd say, well, go ahead, going home. And you were excused. There was no buses and boy, I can sure remember you had to have stamps for everything back during the war.
These were rationing stamps?
Yes. If you wanted meat, you had to have so many stamps. If you had to have gas, stamps for everything. And it created a lot of black market if you weren't careful. Mm-hmm. But I can remember my brother Roger was an artificial breeder for Atlantic. Mm-hmm. breeders, and he run around with as high as 9 blowout patches on his tire, and he'd mix a little kerosene with the gas just so he could get to the farms to breed the farmers' animals. And it was really tough in that respect.
And just for my recollection, the year that you were born was
32.
1932. So you would have been 9 when the war broke out, but you were still living somewhere else at that point.
Yes.
Just for curiosity's sake, how do you remember being aware that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor?
Boy, oh boy, I know.
If you remember.
Yes, I do remember very, very well.
Could you tell us about that?
Yes, I could. My mother come out and yelled to her husband, John, my dad, and said, "Come in here." And they were around the radio. And that's the way I remember it. And then they come out and told us kids.
Mm-hmm. Now,
and I can also say they were both crying.
I can understand that. What are some of the other historical events that may have taken place outside of Emigsville, but that you remember happening while you were living here? Franklin Roosevelt would have been president.
Yep, Franklin Roosevelt was president, and my gollies, it's just hard to remember anything.
Do you remember listening to any of his fireside chats on
Yes,
the radio?
sir. Yes, indeed. We'd listen to every one of them.
Now, you mentioned Bing Crosby. Who were some of the other popular entertainers of the day that you remember?
Well, Perry Como, I think it was one, and Elizabeth, she was born the same day I was. Think of her last name now.
Was she a singer?
A movie star.
Well, it may come to you if it does.
Yeah, I can't. I never had much interest in all that stuff, and I guess it just sort of flies by me.
Well, I suppose I'm just guessing, but that may be a function of having a very involved life here, where you were living every day on the farm. And your world was Emigsville at that point. It wasn't really too much going on outside of Emigsville.
That's a lot of truth in that, yes.
Did you ever have a chance to travel before you reached the age of 21, or were you pretty much on the farm the whole time?
No, I was pretty much on the farm.
Have you?
You wouldn't travel far. You'd go maybe down to the Maryland line to visit family, or that's what it was back then. It was wonderful. You had every week there was somebody. They'd come to our house for Sunday dinner, or we'd go to their house for Sunday dinner. And we need to get back to that in this world.
Was there a trolley that ran through Emigsville at that point?
I don't remember that, no.
Okay. Did you ever go into York for any reason, or was that
Oh, yes.
far away?
Oh, no. We went to York all the time. In fact, we went to church south of York, where I was born and raised, down in New Fairview Church of the Brethren.
Would you take an automobile to go there, or how would you get to this?
Oh, yes. Yes, we had no... the first thing we had was a 38 Buick, but we didn't have that at Emigsville. I think a 37 Ford for sure.
Okay.
And I can just tell you something. In 1949, my dad had a pretty good year. It was a good year for tobacco. Wheat brought $4.25, and a loaf of bread was 17 cents. But that year he bought a New Holland baler, brand new, for $2,451. He bought a 49 Chevrolet Deluxe Chevrolet four-door sedan, $2,150. I just remember that as clear as day, and a side delivery rate for $500. And he still banked $300, so he thought he had a great year.
That must have been a good year. I suspect, though, not all years were good years. There must have been some difficult times in there as well.
Yes, indeed, and it always is. Either maybe it won't rain, or maybe it rained too much that year, but farmers are big gamblers.
Now, you continued farming after you left Emigsville, but in different locations?
Yes, I did. I started it on my own at, like I said, up at Camp Hill, and I was there 4 years. And in that 4 years, I gained a little bit, and Mr. Otto up at Carlisle had 2 farms to rent on the thirds, so I went up there, and I was there for 7 or 8 years. Then I sold out, and I managed a big farm for him. He combined 2 different dairy herds and built a new setup, and I worked that until I went to Riesinger Brothers. They just started a big herd down at, around Mechanicsburg.
Now, when you say you were farming on the thirds, what does that mean?
Well, that meant he bought all the seed. He bought everything we needed. It was up to me to do all the work, pay for all the work. I had to have the machinery and everything, but he paid the taxes, and he bought the seed corn, the seed wheat, so forth, fertilizer. And we did, and I thought it was a pretty fair way of doing it. And then from the date I got there, we'd split the increase in the herd. If you had a bunch of heifers, I got 1/3 of them, and it was a good way of getting started.
Do you think people were perhaps a little more honest and a little more trusting back in those days than they are today, or?
I sure think so. And you do a lot of bartering.
Sure.
That was wonderful, I thought.
Do you have any recollections of either the Emigsville band or the railroad or even the ballpark?
Oh yes, the band. My brother-in-law still plays in it. I guess he's played in it for I don't know how many years, quite a few. Mm-hmm. But I can remember when they had their picnics and everything over at the band hall in Emigsville. Carnivals. I remember I thought my dad was just as tough as nails. They had that thing where you hit the great big wooden hammer and ring the bell up there, and nobody could ring it, and he went up and rang it 3 times. I thought he was tough, but he just knew where to hit it.
Well, that comes from being older and wiser and having a little experience, I guess.
Yep.
Do you have any recollections of the railroad?
Oh yeah, it was back then. It was no diesels; it was all coal-fired engines, and it was very, very busy. And I can remember when there'd be as high as 100 cars on it, and it's uphill the whole way to Harrisburg till you get to Mount Wolf. And sometimes they get stuck. You'd hear them chucking, and all of a sudden the chuck, 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 and the wheels would spin. He'd sit there and blow that whistle, and 15, 20 minutes later, there'd be a couple more engines come behind him, and then they'd push him up over. And about once every year, they'd start the pasture with the sparks coming out. The pasture would catch fire, and it seemed every time that's where the best grass was. It would burn it off. I guess it got rid of a lot of the weeds and everything. It was just as nice and lush green as you could get it.
How would you put out that fire if you found that the train had started the field on fire?
Well, if we couldn't beat it out, and usually in a pasture you can't. There's some dead things. The taller stuff is a little dead, but there's a lot of green in it. We could probably use pitchforks and so forth. Mm-hmm. And if not, we called the Emigsville Fire Company.
Now, where was the Emigsville Fire Company located in those days, if you remember?
I can remember where it was right at the south end of Emigsville on the right hand. Going towards York would be on the right hand side.
Okay.
But the first I can remember was just, I guess it's right up here in this corner.
They had the band?
Yes, sir.
On North George Street?
Yep.
Now, it was an all-volunteer fire company in
Yeah,
those days?
and the Schaefers really devoted a lot of time to it.
Now, that was Paul Schaefer, who was the son
Paul
of the...
and his brother Dats. We always call him Dats. I don't really know his right name.
Okay.
And his father was really, really involved.
Now, it was his father that ran the appliance store?
Yes.
I believe that's now the local pizzeria down there.
Is that right?
So,
It was a beer distributor for a while.
yes, was a beer distributor, but I think now it is a pizzeria.
I'll be
But I
doggone.
know the building because my family would buy things there
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. How'd you meet your wife, your first wife?
Well, when I went to Allen Dairy Farm, they sold out, and there's a professor from Maryland, University of Maryland, named Johnny Morris. I met him at the Pennsylvania Farm Show. He says, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I don't know. I have a notion to get in the trucking business." In fact, I had two tractors ordered. "Oh, man," he said, "you don't want to do that." He said, "There's such a need for an excellent foot trimmer." And that's what I did at Allen Dairy Farm. And it's just like a racehorse. How you trim them, you make them walk the way you want. Or you take a racehorse, if he reaches too far with his hind legs, you give him a little more heel, shorten his stride, you know. And I become pretty good at the cattle. And he talked me into getting a chute and doing it the easy way, and a tilt table that laid them right over, and you could secure their legs, and then you could go with automatic equipment and really do a right job. So that's what I got into.
Now, but somehow we missed the question, which was, how did you meet your wife?
My wife, yep, went right over that one, didn't I?
Maybe I shouldn't ask the question.
Well, I was leading up to it. So I started foot trimming. And she was single and I was single. And I got this call to trim feet up in back of Newburgh, Pennsylvania. She was taking a bunch of cattle to the Shippensburg Fair. And they needed them done pretty quickly. And I went up, and here was this little gal just leading every cow out and in the chute, just worked like a man. And I thought, boy, that's the gal for me. So I said, "Do you want to go for dinner sometime?" She led the cow back in, didn't say nothing. When she come back out, she said, "Yes, I would." Well, I said, "When would you like?" "Tonight." That was the beginning of a beautiful relationship.
What was her name?
Her name was Linda Mohn, M-O-H-N.
Okay. And do you have children?
We don't have any of our own, but I have 2 boys and 2 girls, and she had 2 boys.
Okay.
And we just get along, all of us, just wonderful. We have dinners together, and it's great.
That's good. That's good. Are there other things that you would like to just tell our listeners about your life in Emigsville that I haven't touched on in my questions?
Well, I think it was some of the best years of my life, George. And I met a lot of good people, and we just had an awful lot of good fun. And at Halloween, we really had fun. We'd start a month early, and we could Halloween pretty good.
What were some of the things you remember about Halloween?
Well, I can remember can I mention names?
Sure.
Do you remember Herman Nace
I
up on?
know the family name, yes.
Well, he lived on High Street, and the pines were there, you know.
Mm-hmm.
We get a nice little fine copper wire, and somebody crawl up on his porch roof, hook this wire to his spouting, and then we'd have a big hunk of resin, and we'd sit up there in the pines, and boy, we'd serenade him until he couldn't take it no more, and he'd call the police, and the police couldn't catch us. We knew the pines a little better than they did.
I can imagine.
But it was really all good fun.
Oh, sure. Anything
And
else?
sledding. Boy, I can remember sledding on Sinking Springs Lane Hill.
Well, that's quite a drop there.
Oh, that was wonderful. It was just wonderful. I can remember sitting in school in Emigsville, and there's an old German fella would come around with a huckster wagon. Had a horse pulling the wagon, and he'd sell vegetables and fish and so forth. And I can still hear him coming up through. He'd start hollering to the ladies, "Wet your tables, wet your tables, wet your tables." That always stuck with me.
Very good. Where was the school located when you attended?
Right down here on Broad Street.
Okay, that's the two-story brick building down there?
Yeah, yep. And they had 3 rooms. And like I said, they didn't have enough room for 6th grade, so if you were smart enough, you went to 7th, and if you weren't, you stayed back in 5th another year.
What was how would the teachers handle the fact that they were trying to teach children that had several different grades of education and were trying to teach several different subjects all at the same time?
I don't know, but you know what? You could learn more that way than you could any other way. They just sort of had a knack of handling it. The first school I ever went to was a 1-room schoolhouse. And I figured I learned as much in that as anywhere. If you got your grades work done, you could sit there and listen to all of them. Or if you missed something, you could listen to the grade below you. And I just thought it was a pretty good way of educating. Mm-hmm. It was good enough to educate a governor.
Yeah, well, are you referring to George Leader? Or?
George Leader, him and my family, well, his family and my family were great friends. Because he just lived up over the hill to Leader's Heights from the new Fairview Church where I was born.
Yeah, I remember when Governor Leader was inaugurated, my father and a bunch of people went up to Harrisburg.
Is that right?
To, watch the ceremony and so on.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Did you ever know my father, John Emig?
I don't think I did.
I guess we got out of here.
I was born in 1948, and we moved to Emigsville when I was 9 years old in 1957. So I don't really have any Emigsville memories earlier than that, except that on your farm, I was told the story by a lady named Sally Rudder, who was living on that farm in 1953. And she was probably in her 90s, and I was only 5 years old.
Yeah.
But she told me how the Confederates had come through Emigsville during the Civil War, and they had camped up on the hill that is called Oak Orchard, which was owned by the Baker family.
Oh, yeah.
And her father had a pistol that was an old cap and ball revolver that was the type that once you loaded it, the only way to unload it was to take it out and shoot it off. So he had driven the cattle over to Lancaster County when he heard the Confederates were coming. He left the revolver with his wife. When he came back, he didn't want this loaded revolver in the house.
Yeah.
So he went out and fired off the 6 rounds. Well, the Confederates were up on the hill, and they heard him fire these 6 shots. So they thought he was some crazy Yankee trying to take them on. So they got on their horses, came down under the bridge, as you said, and surrounded the farmhouse. And Sally Rudder was telling me that she remembered as a little girl, 6 years of age, her mother cooking dinner for these Confederate soldiers. And then the next day, the Confederates went on their way to the Battle of Gettysburg and were never seen in Yankee territory again. But that happened on your farm.
I'll be doggone.
Is there anything that you would
No,
like to
that was
add?
excellent.
Well, again, I want to thank you very much for taking your time to share these memories with our listeners, and we appreciate very much your coming such a long distance, not only once, but twice. So we'll also look forward to tonight's gathering.
Okay, well, thank you so much, George, and I aim to be back quite a bit more because I'm really into this genealogy thing now.
Well, we'll look forward to hearing more about that. Thank you.
Okay.